The carburetor should be disassembled, cleaned, and inspected each time that the engine is overhauled. Before removing the carburetor from the engine, be sure to shut off the fuel supply valve in the cabin. Then disconnect the various lines leading to the carburetor. The fuel supply line, the primer line, and the heat control. Disconnect the intake pipes at the carburetor. On the other side of the engine, disconnect the throttle control. Then the heater pipe. Now remove the nuts that attach the manifold to the engine, and the whole assembly can be taken to the workbench for an overhaul. After removing the securing screws, the air intake will slide off the mounting plate. Cut the safety wire, and the plate can be taken off by removing the 4 nuts that hold it to the carburetor. Now remove the manifold, and the carburetor can be taken apart, cleaned, and tested. The 2 halves of the carburetor are held together by Philister head screws. When you remove these screws and separate the 2 halves, pull them apart carefully and straight so you don't bend the idling tube. You'll use a new gasket when you reassemble the carburetor, so discard the old one. To disassemble the float and the float needle valve, remove the set screw that holds the float fulcrum pin in place. Then remove the plug at the side of the carburetor to free the float fulcrum pin. Use a hooked wire to poke the pin out so you can grasp it. The float and the float needle valve are now free to be removed. The needle valve seat is safetied to the casting with wire, which must be cut. To loosen the needle valve seat, you'll need a special tool that fits the slot. There's a little washer under the seat you can pick out with tweezers. Now unscrew the main metering jet and lift it out. Only 1 bolt on the side of the carburetor needs to be removed to get the venturi out. In unscrewing the idling tube from the body of the carburetor, protect it by putting a piece of cloth in the jaws of the pliers. Next, cut the wire that safeties the main discharge nozzle and air bleed. You'll have to use an offset wrench to loosen the nozzle. Then you can unscrew it and remove it. Now cut the safety wire and unscrew the two Philister head screws, holding the cover to the throttle body, and disassemble the mixture control. A hooked wire will help you get the round plate out. With the carburetor disassembled, your first job is to clean all the parts, including the bodies, in unleaded gasoline. Wash them thoroughly to remove all traces of dirt. A stiff brush will help you clean inaccessible parts of the bodies. Use an air gun to dry the parts. When you clean the lower half, take the screen out and clean it too. After all the parts are clean and dry, use an air hose to blow out all passages in the bodies of the carburetor. Inspect each part before reinstalling it. Look for scores, particularly on the mixture control disc. When you replace the disc in the mixture control, the large hole should be lined up with the hole in the lower plate. Then, with the mixture control lever at the stop in the full rich position, replace the cover and safety it. Be sure to use a new gasket, because a leak will destroy the usefulness of the mixture control. Before replacing the main discharge nozzle and main air bleed, examine them for cracks or burrs. Then put them together with new gaskets between the parts and reinstall them in the body. Be sure to safety the main discharge nozzle. Now you can install the idling tube, but first you want to check the size of the hole in the tube. To do this, use a drill of the same number as that stamped on the tube. If the shank of the drill fits snugly in the hole, the jet is of the right size. Screw the idling tube back into the body of the carburetor, tightening it with pliers and using a protecting piece of cloth. If the venturi is in good condition, you can reinstall it now. To be sure it's installed correctly, line up the bolt hole in the venturi with the corresponding hole in the body. The main metering jet should be checked with a drill, the same way you check the idling tube. If the size of the jet is satisfactory, you can screw it back into the carburetor. See that the screwdriver you use fits snugly in the slot and isn't wider than the head of the jet. Otherwise, you might damage the jet. Now inspect the float needle valve seat very carefully for scratches or burrs. The seat and needle valve are a matched pair. If either is damaged, both of them should be replaced. This needle valve is grooved from use and can't be repaired to make it leak-proof. Discard the needle valve and its seat and install new parts. The new parts come as a matched set. Drop the washer in the recess and square it up. Then start the new seat carefully so as not to cross the threads and tighten it with the tool you used before. To make sure the valve and seat are absolutely leak-proof, the valve should be lapped into the seat. This is done with a fine scouring powder placed on the point of the valve. Place the valve in its seat and turn it lightly with your fingers. Change the position of the valve on its seat frequently to lap it evenly. When you're through lapping, wipe the compound off the point and be sure also to blow it out of the seat. Before reinstalling the float, inspect it carefully for leaky seams or worn spots. If there's a leak, you'll hear liquid in the float. Remember that a heavy float causes a rich mixture. See that the pin's in good condition, too. Now pair up the float and needle valve and install them. Now you want to check the fuel level. For this, you'll need a leveling plate and a fuel container placed high enough to give a flow of fuel to equal operating pressure. Attach the hose from the fuel container to the carburetor inlet. The fuel pressure must equal that existing during operation. Then level up the surface plate. Use a spirit level laid on the parting surface. Level up the carburetor in 2 directions. Then recheck the level in the first direction. Now turn on the fuel and let it run into the carburetor. The float will rise and cause the needle valve to close. Your engine manual says the fuel level should be 13/32 of an inch below the parting surface. The fuel level in this case is too high by 4/32 of an inch. When you installed the new needle valve in the seat, the gasket used under the seat was too thin. You'll have to make an adjustment by removing the needle valve seat again and installing a slightly thicker gasket. The thickness of the gasket changes the float level at a ratio of 5:1. So you can figure out how much thicker the new gasket should be. Measure the thickness of the old gasket with a micrometer. Now, if you select a new gasket not quite 1/32 of an inch thicker, the fuel level will be raised 4/32 of an inch. When you have a new gasket of the right thickness, reassemble the valve. Now make the test again, the same as you did before. Again, measure the distance from the parting surface to the fuel. This time, the distance is 13/32 of an inch, which is just right. To check the butterfly valve, hold it up to be sure you can't see any light around it when it's closed. Check the lever mechanism and tighten the lever if necessary. Before putting the 2 halves of the carburetor back together, check the fit of the new gasket. Take a look to see that the internal parts are safetied. Now fit the 2 halves together carefully and reinstall the fillister head screws that hold the carburetor together. Then safety the screws. Before putting the air intake back, the filter must be cleaned. Remove it from the intake. Clean the filter thoroughly in unleaded gasoline, removing all the oil and dirt that's collected in the meshes. Then dry and blow it out with an air hose. Before replacing the filter, dip the face of it in light oil. This oil will help to catch dust and dirt that might otherwise get into the carburetor. Wipe out the air intake. check the heat control for full throw and free operation. Then replace the filter in the air scoop. Now you can put the carburetor and the air intake back together. Then the carburetor and air intake can be installed to the intake manifold. The assembly is now ready to be reinstalled. When all the reconnections have been made, it's a good idea to turn on the fuel shut-off valve and look for possible leaks. If you find no leaks, your job of overhauling the carburetor is finished.